She carried their plates with steady hands, while they whispered behind her back about the pathetic waitress who'd been serving the same diner for 15 years. But when the foreclosure notices arrived and the town's elite found themselves powerless, one quiet woman would reveal she held all the cards, and the transformation that followed would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about power, wealth, and worth. The morning sun filtered through the smudged windows of Miller's diner, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor, where Emma Rodriguez had walked the same path for over a decade and a half. The red vinyl booths held the impressions of countless customers who had come and gone, treating her like part of the furniture, invisible except when they needed their coffee refilled or their orders corrected. At 42, Emma moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had mastered every corner of this small space, knowing exactly how many steps it took from the coffee station to table 6, where the mayor always sat on Tuesday mornings, or the precise timing needed to flip pancakes while taking an order and wiping down the counter. Her dark hair was pulled back in the same simple ponytail she'd worn for years, practical and unremarkable, like everything else about her appearance. The navy blue uniform with Miller's Diner embroidered in faded yellow thread hung loosely on her slight frame, making her seem even smaller than she was. Her hands bore the calluses and small burns that marked years of carrying hot plates and scrubbing stubborn stains, testimony to honest work that few in this town bothered to notice or respect. Miller's Diner sat at the heart of Riverside, a town of 8,000 people nestled in a valley where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The diner had been the unofficial town hall for decades, where deals were made, gossip was traded, and social hierarchies were reinforced with every interaction. Emma had witnessed it all, from behind the counter, watching the same patterns play out day after day, year after year, as the town's influential citizens conducted their business over coffee and pie, treating her as nothing more than a silent service provider. The morning rush was beginning as Emma tied her apron and checked the coffee levels, preparing for another day of invisible servitude. She had no way of knowing that this particular Tuesday would mark the beginning of the end for the comfortable assumptions that had defined her world, and that soon the very people who looked through her would find themselves desperately seeking her attention, for reasons none of them could have imagined. The brass bell above the door chimed its familiar greeting as Riverside's morning regulars began filtering in, each one settling into their established territories with the confidence of people who believed they owned not just their favorite seats, but the very fabric of the community itself. Mayor Jonathan Hartley claimed his usual booth by the window, adjusting his expensive suit jacket as he spread the morning paper across the red vinyl surface. At 65, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had held power for 2 decades, believing his position made him indispensable to the town's functioning. His silver hair was perfectly styled, even at 7 in the morning, and his gold watch caught the light as he gestured dismissively for coffee, without bothering to make eye contact with Emma. Behind him at the counter sat Frank Morrison, the town's wealthiest contractor, whose construction company had built half the new developments in the county. Frank's success had made him loud and presumptuous, always ready with opinions about how things should be run and who deserved respect in their small community. His expensive boots rested on the footrail as he held court with whoever would listen, never acknowledging Emma except to bark orders for his usual breakfast. Near the back booth, Rebecca Sterling, the bank manager, reviewed files while sipping her coffee with the air of someone who controlled the financial destiny of everyone around her. Her designer handbag rested on the seat beside her, a deliberate display of status in a town where such symbols mattered deeply to those who felt they needed to prove their importance. The conversations that morning followed familiar patterns: complaints about property taxes, speculation about the new shopping development, and gossip about families who were struggling to keep up with their mortgages. Emma moved between them like a ghost, refilling cups and clearing plates, while absorbing fragments of their discussions that revealed the casual cruelty with which they discussed their fellow citizens. She had learned long ago to keep her observations to herself, understanding that her opinions were neither wanted nor welcomed in their carefully constructed social order. What none of them realized as they sat in their comfortable certainty was that Emma had been listening carefully for 15 years, accumulating knowledge about their financial dealings, their personal struggles, and their hidden vulnerabilities. She knew which businesses were barely staying afloat, which marriages were crumbling under financial pressure, and which of the town's prominent citizens were living far beyond their means, sustained only by carefully maintained appearances. The morning routine continued predictably, with Emma serving breakfast to people who had never bothered to learn her last name or ask about her life beyond the diner walls. They saw only what they expected to see, an aging waitress trapped in a dead-end job, too simple or too lazy to aspire to anything greater. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more interesting than any of them could have imagined. But revelation would come in its own time and in ways that would shake the foundation of everything they believed about their small town and their place within it. The lunch crowd brought its own familiar faces and renewed displays of casual dismissal as Emma continued her dance between tables, carrying the weight of secrets that would soon transform from hidden knowledge into undeniable power. But for now, she remained invisible, moving through her world with the patience of someone who understood that timing was everything, and that sometimes the most profound changes began with the quietest observers. The afternoon sun had shifted to cast different shadows across the diner floor when the first signs of change appeared in the form of certified mail deliveries that would disrupt the comfortable routines of Riverside's most prominent citizens. Emma was wiping down the counter when she noticed Mayor Hartley's face go pale as he read an official-looking document that had arrived with his lunch. Across the room, Frank Morrison was having a heated phone conversation, his voice rising with each exchange as he gripped another piece of certified mail. The atmosphere in the diner began to shift from casual conversation to urgent whispers as more envelopes arrived throughout the day, each one carrying news that seemed to drain the color from its recipient's face. Rebecca Sterling had abandoned her usual composed demeanor, frantically making calls while staring at documents spread across her table. Emma continued serving coffee and clearing plates, but she could feel the tension building like an approaching storm that would soon break over their small community. By mid-afternoon, the whispered conversations had grown more desperate as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The shopping development that had promised to bring prosperity to Riverside was in serious financial trouble, and the investors, who had seemed so confident just months earlier, were now facing foreclosure proceedings that could destroy not only their own investments, but drag down several other businesses that had extended credit or made commitments based on the project's success. The domino effect was becoming clear, as one by one, the town's financial pillars discovered their interconnected vulnerabilities. What had seemed like smart business partnerships and mutually beneficial arrangements were now revealed as a house of cards that was beginning to collapse under the weight of overextended credit and misplaced trust. Emma watched the drama unfold with careful attention, noting how quickly confidence could crumble when the underlying assumptions proved false. Mayor Hartley was fielding angry calls from constituents who were learning that city funds had been invested in the failing development, while Frank Morrison discovered that his construction contracts were worthless if the project couldn't be completed. Rebecca Sterling faced the nightmare scenario of having to explain to her bank's board how so many loans had been approved for a project that was now threatening to default. The very people who had spent their mornings discussing the financial struggles of others were now confronting their own precarious situations with growing panic and diminishing options. As the day wore on, Emma began to notice something else. The way they looked at her was changing. Where once their glances had been dismissive or absent entirely, now there was something different in their eyes when they thought she wasn't watching. Speculation, perhaps, or the beginning recognition that in a small town, information was valuable, and that someone who had been invisible for 15 years might have noticed more than they had ever considered possible. The conversations grew more guarded as they began to wonder who else might be listening. and what other secrets might be hidden behind the familiar faces they had taken for granted for so long. Emma felt the shift in dynamics, like a subtle electrical charge in the air, understanding that her position as the unnoticed observer was about to change in ways that would surprise everyone, including herself. The weight of knowledge she had carried silently for so many years was about to become the key to transformations that none of them could have predicted. And the invisible waitress was about to step into a role that would redefine not only her own life, but the entire balance of power in their small community. The evening shift brought a different energy to the diner as word spread through Riverside about the financial crisis that was threatening to engulf the town's leadership and many of its most established businesses. Emma had worked through countless dinner rushes, but tonight felt different as conversations buzzed with uncertainty and speculation about what would happen next. The usual confident discussions about town business had been replaced by worried whispers and desperate phone calls as people tried to understand the scope of the disaster that was unfolding. Mayor Hartley sat slumped in his usual booth, no longer the commanding figure who had dominated morning conversations, but a man facing the potential destruction of his political career and personal finances. The development project that was supposed to be his legacy was now threatening to become the scandal that would end his time in office. Frank Morrison had abandoned his typical boastful demeanor and was frantically trying to contact lawyers and accountants who might help him navigate the legal and financial maze that was tightening around him. Rebecca Sterling had left the bank early but returned to the diner that evening, looking haggard and desperate as she tried to manage a crisis that was spinning beyond her control. The domino effect was accelerating as other business owners began to understand how the failing development would impact their own operations and the broader economic health of the community. Emma moved through this chaos with her usual steady professionalism, but she could feel the growing attention focused on her as people began to wonder what she might know and whether her 15 years of quiet observation had revealed insights that could help them understand their current predicament. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable as the invisible waitress began to occupy more space in their conscious awareness, not yet as someone with power, but as someone who might possess valuable information. As the evening progressed, Emma found herself in the unprecedented position of being approached directly by people who had never bothered to engage her in conversation beyond placing their orders. Mayor Hartley cleared his throat and attempted to strike up a casual conversation about how long she had worked at the diner and what changes she had observed in the town over the years. Frank Morrison awkwardly tried to ask whether she had heard anything about the development project that might help him understand what had gone wrong. Rebecca Sterling even went so far as to inquire about Emma's observations regarding the financial health of various local businesses, as if her perspective as a longtime server might provide insights that their professional analyses had missed. Emma responded to these overtures with careful politeness, neither revealing the depth of her knowledge nor completely dismissing their interest. She understood intuitively that information was power, and that her years of patient observation had given her a unique understanding of the complex web of relationships and dependencies that held their community together. But she also recognized that timing was crucial and that premature revelation might diminish rather than enhance her position in the changing dynamics of their small town. The evening ended with an unusual sense of expectation hanging over the diner, as if everyone understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something significant, but couldn't yet identify what that might be. Emma finished her closing duties with the same methodical attention she had shown for years, but she could feel the weight of unspoken questions and growing speculation that would only intensify as the crisis deepened and the search for solutions grew more desperate. The comfortable assumptions about social order and economic stability that had defined Riverside for decades were crumbling, and in their place, something new was beginning to emerge that would challenge everything the town's residents thought they knew about power, influence, and worth. The quiet waitress who had remained invisible for so long was about to become the most important person in town, though none of them, including Emma herself, yet fully understood how dramatically their world was about to change. The next morning brought a scene unlike any Miller's Diner had witnessed in its 50-year history, as Emma arrived to find a line of cars already parked outside, and several of the town's most prominent citizens waiting anxiously for the doors to open. The crisis had deepened overnight as more details emerged about the scope of the financial disaster and the interconnected nature of the obligations that were now threatening to bring down not just individual businesses, but the entire economic foundation of Riverside. Mayor Hartley was pacing outside the entrance, his usual composed political demeanor replaced by the desperate energy of someone facing potential ruin, while Frank Morrison sat heavily in his truck, making phone calls that clearly weren't producing the answers he needed. Rebecca Sterling stood apart from the others, clutching a folder of documents that represented her bank's exposure to the failing development and the lawsuits that were already being filed by investors who had lost everything in the collapse. Emma unlocked the door and began her opening routine, but the atmosphere was charged with an urgency that transformed the familiar space into something resembling a crisis command center, rather than a neighborhood restaurant. The conversations that began as soon as coffee was served were no longer about casual gossip or routine business, but desperate strategizing sessions as people tried to find ways to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their financial plans. What became clear as the morning progressed was that the crisis extended far beyond the immediate investors in the failed development and reached into nearly every aspect of the town's economic life. The contractor who had been hired to do the electrical work was facing bankruptcy because his payments were tied to project milestones that would never be reached. The local lumber company had extended credit for materials that would never be paid for. Even the town's modest newspaper was in jeopardy because the development had been their largest advertiser, and without that revenue, they couldn't meet their own obligations. Emma listened to these revelations with growing understanding of just how completely the confident predictions of prosperity had been replaced by a cascade of interconnected failures that threatened to devastate the entire community. But as she moved between tables, refilling coffee and taking orders, she began to notice something else in their conversations: references to properties and business dealings that triggered memories of overheard discussions from years past, when the same people had been far more careless about what they said within earshot of the invisible waitress. The puzzle pieces were forming a picture that none of them could see individually, but that Emma's years of patient observation had given her the perspective to understand. The morning reached a crescendo of desperation when Mayor Hartley stood up and made an impromptu announcement to the gathered group that the town council would be holding an emergency meeting that afternoon to discuss their options for dealing with the crisis. His voice carried the forced confidence of a politician trying to maintain authority in circumstances that had moved far beyond his control. But Emma could see the fear in his eyes as he spoke about the possibility of declaring a financial emergency that would bring state oversight to their community. Frank Morrison immediately objected, arguing that outside intervention would only make things worse and that they needed to find local solutions to their problems. But his protests lacked conviction, as everyone present understood that their resources were already exhausted and their options were rapidly diminishing. Rebecca Sterling added her own concerns about the banking regulations that would be triggered if the crisis continued to deepen, warning that the consequences could extend far beyond their immediate community and affect the broader regional economy. As these discussions intensified, Emma felt the weight of their collective gaze settling on her more frequently, as if they were beginning to recognize that her unique position as the longtime observer of their community might hold insights that their panic was preventing them from seeing clearly. The invisible waitress was becoming visible, not yet as someone with solutions, but as someone whose perspective might be valuable in ways they were only beginning to understand. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable, as people who had never bothered to learn her name began to treat her with a respect that would have been unimaginable just days earlier, when their world had seemed secure and their positions unassailable. The emergency town council meeting that afternoon would prove to be the turning point, where Emma's long invisible presence would finally step into the light, and the true scope of her knowledge and influence would begin to reshape everything the residents of Riverside thought they understood about their community and themselves. The packed town hall buzzed with an energy that Emma had never experienced in her 15 years of quiet observation, as she slipped into a back row seat to witness what everyone expected would be a desperate attempt to find solutions to their mounting financial crisis. The usual order of business had been abandoned as Mayor Hartley called the emergency session to address what he termed the most serious threat to Riverside's stability in its 100-year history. The wooden folding chairs were filled with faces Emma recognized from years of serving coffee and breakfast. People who had never acknowledged her presence, now turning to look at her with curiosity and something approaching respect, as word had spread about her unique perspective on the town's inner workings. Frank Morrison took the floor first, his voice heavy with defeat as he outlined the scope of the construction industry collapse that was rippling through the community, affecting not just his own company, but dozens of subcontractors and suppliers who had built their businesses around the failed development project. Rebecca Sterling followed with a banking perspective that painted an even grimmer picture of over-leveraged loans, interconnected obligations, and regulatory consequences that could trigger federal intervention in their local financial institutions. The audience listened with growing horror as the full extent of their collective vulnerability became clear, and the comfortable assumptions about their town's prosperity were systematically dismantled by the harsh mathematics of financial reality. Mayor Hartley attempted to maintain order as voices rose in accusation and desperation, with families who had invested their life savings demanding answers from the leaders who had encouraged their participation, while those same leaders struggled to explain how their careful planning had resulted in such catastrophic failure. Emma sat quietly, absorbing the emotion and chaos, while her mind processed the various pieces of information she had gathered over the years, fitting them together into a comprehensive understanding of how the current crisis had developed and, more importantly, what resources might still be available to address it. As the meeting devolved into increasingly desperate arguments about blame and responsibility, Emma made a decision that would transform not only her own life, but the entire trajectory of her community's future. She stood up slowly, drawing attention as conversations gradually quieted and all eyes turned to the woman who had remained invisible for so long, but was now stepping forward to speak with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. Mayor Hartley paused mid-sentence as he recognized Emma and gestured for her to approach the microphone, his political instincts telling him that any new perspective might be valuable, even if it came from someone he had never considered worthy of serious attention. Emma walked steadily to the front of the room, feeling the weight of their collective focus, but drawing strength from her years of patient preparation for a moment she had never consciously anticipated, but now seemed inevitable. Her voice was quiet but clear as she began to speak, and the packed room leaned forward to catch every word, understanding instinctively that they were about to hear something that would change everything they thought they knew about their community and their crisis. The transformation from invisible observer to central figure was happening in real time as Emma prepared to reveal knowledge that would reshape the balance of power in Riverside and demonstrate that the most overlooked person in their community had been the most informed all along. What she was about to say would not only provide solutions to their immediate crisis, but reveal the depth of wisdom and capability that had been hidden behind years of quiet service, challenging every assumption they had made about worth, talent, and leadership in their small-town world. Emma's voice carried clearly through the silent town hall as she began to speak with a confidence that seemed to emerge from nowhere, yet felt completely natural, as if she had been preparing for this moment throughout her 15 years of careful observation. She started by addressing the immediate crisis with a level of detail that stunned the audience, as she outlined not just the obvious connections between the failing development and the current financial disaster, but deeper relationships that none of the town's leaders had recognized, involving property ownership patterns, investment flows, and regulatory obligations that extended far beyond their community. Her analysis demonstrated an understanding of complex financial systems that seemed impossible for someone they had dismissed as a simple waitress. Yet every detail she provided was accurate and verifiable, as several people began checking her statements against their own records and finding them correct in ways that revealed the superficial nature of their own knowledge about their community's economic foundation. Mayor Hartley found himself taking notes as Emma explained how the development crisis was actually the symptom rather than the cause of problems that had been building for years, as the town's leadership had made decisions based on incomplete information and assumptions that had never been properly examined. Frank Morrison's face grew pale as Emma described the intricate web of subcontracts and supplier agreements that had created the cascading failure pattern, but then offered insights into which relationships could be salvaged and which needed to be restructured to minimize long-term damage to the construction industry in their area. Rebecca Sterling was simultaneously horrified and impressed as Emma revealed knowledge about banking relationships and credit flows that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of financial regulations and risk management principles that few people outside the banking industry possessed. Yet somehow, this unassuming waitress had acquired through years of patient observation and self-directed study. As Emma continued speaking, the atmosphere in the room shifted from desperate chaos to focused attention as people began to realize they were hearing not just analysis, but practical solutions that addressed their immediate crisis, while laying groundwork for long-term stability that went far beyond anything their previous leadership had envisioned. Her recommendations were specific and actionable, involving property acquisitions that could be made at distressed prices to create new economic development opportunities, debt restructuring strategies that could preserve viable businesses while allowing failed enterprises to close without destroying their suppliers, and regulatory approaches that could satisfy state oversight requirements while maintaining local control over their recovery process. What became increasingly clear as Emma spoke was that her 15 years of invisible observation had given her not just information, but wisdom about how their community actually functioned beneath the surface of official structures and public relationships. And this understanding was now proving invaluable as they faced challenges that traditional leadership approaches had been unable to address. The questions that followed her presentation revealed the extent to which she had thought through every aspect of their situation, offering detailed responses that demonstrated months or even years of careful analysis that had been conducted quietly while she continued her daily routine of serving coffee and cleaning tables, apparently preparing for exactly this kind of crisis, even though none of them could have predicted when or how it would arise. Mayor Hartley finally asked the question that everyone was thinking, but had been afraid to voice directly, asking how someone in her position could have acquired such comprehensive knowledge about their town's financial systems and what other insights she might have that could help them navigate their recovery process. Emma's response would reveal the final piece of the puzzle that would transform her from respected advisor to the most important person in Riverside, as she prepared to share the truth that would not only solve their immediate crisis, but establish a new foundation for their community's future that none of them could have imagined when they had walked into the meeting just hours earlier. Emma's smile was gentle but unmistakable as she looked around the room at faces that had never truly seen her before this moment, and began to share the truth that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of their community and their crisis. She explained that her 15 years at Miller's Diner had indeed provided her with unprecedented access to information about the town's business dealings and financial relationships, but that her knowledge went far deeper than simple observation and extended into areas that would surprise them in ways they were not yet prepared to understand. Her voice remained calm and measured as she revealed that she held degrees in economics and business administration from the State University, completed through night classes and correspondence courses during her years of seemingly simple waitress work, and that her position at the diner had been not the limitation they assumed, but a chosen vantage point that provided optimal access to the information she needed to understand exactly how Riverside's economy functioned. The room grew even quieter as she continued explaining that her family background included significant experience in real estate development and investment management, and that her decision to work at the diner had been part of a long-term strategy to understand their community from the ground up before making the major investments that she had been planning for over a decade. Mayor Hartley's voice was barely above a whisper as he asked what investments she was referring to, and Emma's response sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd as she calmly stated that she had been quietly acquiring properties throughout Riverside for the past 12 years and now owned approximately 40% of the commercial real estate in the downtown area, including the buildings that housed most of their struggling businesses. Frank Morrison demanded to know how someone working as a waitress could have afforded such acquisitions, and Emma explained that her initial capital had come from a settlement following her husband's death in an industrial accident 7 years earlier, but that her real success had come from her ability to identify undervalued properties and negotiate favorable terms with sellers who had underestimated her financial capabilities because they had made the same assumptions about her worth and intelligence that everyone else in town had made. Rebecca Sterling was frantically calculating the implications as Emma revealed that her property holdings included not just commercial buildings, but residential developments and undeveloped land that positioned her as one of the largest property owners in the entire county, with financial resources that exceeded those of any other individual or business entity in their community. The development project that had seemed so central to their crisis was revealed to be relatively minor compared to Emma's broader investment portfolio and her strategic planning for Riverside's economic future, which had anticipated exactly the kind of speculative bubble and inevitable collapse that they were now experiencing. As the full scope of Emma's position became clear, the audience began to understand that they were not just facing a crisis, but an opportunity for fundamental transformation under the guidance of someone who had been preparing for this moment far longer than any of them had been aware of the vulnerabilities that were now threatening their community. Emma's final revelation that she had been developing comprehensive plans for economic revitalization that could address not only their immediate financial crisis, but create sustainable prosperity for decades to come, left the room in stunned silence as people absorbed the reality that their salvation had been sitting quietly among them all along, serving coffee and listening carefully while they struggled with problems she had already solved. The invisible waitress had become the most powerful person in Riverside, and her transformation from overlooked service worker to community leader would reshape everything about how they understood success, authority, and the hidden potential that existed within their apparently ordinary neighbors. The implications of this revelation would extend far beyond their current crisis as Emma prepared to implement changes that would create a new model for small-town prosperity based on principles of inclusion, collaboration, and recognition of worth that went far beyond traditional assumptions about who deserved respect and influence in their community. 6 months after that transformative town hall meeting, Emma Rodriguez stood in the newly renovated community center that had once been the abandoned department store on Main Street, watching as Riverside's first annual Community Appreciation Festival brought together residents who were still adjusting to the remarkable changes that had reshaped their town and their understanding of hidden potential within their neighbors. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their community had instead become the catalyst for unprecedented prosperity, as Emma's strategic investments and development plans had not only saved the struggling businesses, but created new opportunities that attracted young families and entrepreneurs from across the region. Mayor Hartley approached with a humility that would have been unimaginable during his years of presumptuous authority, offering to introduce Emma to a group of urban planning specialists who had come to study Riverside's transformation as a model for rural economic development that other communities might adapt to their own circumstances. Frank Morrison was supervising the construction of the new affordable housing complex that Emma had commissioned as part of her comprehensive development strategy, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine respect for someone whose vision had saved his business and provided him with the most meaningful work of his career. Rebecca Sterling had become Emma's financial partner in establishing the Community Development Bank that provided microloans and business support services to residents who had never previously had access to capital or professional guidance for their entrepreneurial dreams. The festival showcased not just economic recovery, but social transformation, as the rigid hierarchy that had once defined Riverside had given way to a more inclusive community structure, where people were valued for their contributions rather than their presumed social status or family connections. Emma moved through the celebration with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed, but now people understood that her modesty reflected strength rather than limitation, and that her years of patient observation had prepared her for leadership that extended far beyond financial success into areas of community building and social justice that created opportunities for everyone to thrive. The teenagers manning the information booths included several scholarship recipients from Emma's Education Foundation, which provided college funding for students whose families had never imagined higher education was possible for their children, while the Small Business Pavilion featured ventures that had started with her microloan program and grown into enterprises that provided employment and services that strengthened the entire community. Former customers from Miller's Diner now approached Emma with gratitude for opportunities they had received and respect for wisdom they had failed to recognize during the years when they had looked through her rather than at her, understanding finally that intelligence and capability could not be measured by social position or external appearance. The festival concluded with Emma being presented with a key to the city by Mayor Hartley, who acknowledged publicly that her leadership had not only saved Riverside from financial disaster, but had created a new model for community development that recognized and cultivated the potential that existed within every resident, regardless of their background or previous circumstances. As the evening wound down, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible waitress to respected community leader, understanding that her transformation had been possible only because she had refused to accept others' limitations on her worth and had instead used their dismissal as an opportunity to observe, learn, and prepare for the moment when her knowledge and resources could make the greatest difference. The question she posed to the remaining festival attendees was whether they had learned to look more carefully at the people around them and recognize that extraordinary capabilities might be hidden behind ordinary appearances, waiting for the right moment and the right support to emerge and transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Her story had become Riverside's story, demonstrating that the most powerful changes often began with the quietest voices, and that true leadership came not from asserting dominance, but from recognizing and developing the potential that existed within everyone who had been overlooked or underestimated by those who confused visibility with value and assumed that worth could be measured by social position rather than character and capability.